The TOEIC program presents Principles of Quality Assessments. Why assessment matters. In today's competitive global market, effectively communicating with colleagues, customers, and partners around the world is essential. Now, more than ever, having an English proficient workforce is vital for business success. In fact, English is spoken by 1 in 4 people globally and is the most widely used language in the world. How can you ensure that your workforce has the English language skills required to succeed? In order to build a strong, capable workforce, decision makers such as human resource managers need to be able to make confident hiring, training, and promotion decisions. Additionally, educational institutions need to ensure graduates are prepared for the global workforce. The consequences of making the wrong decision can be costly for your organization, both monetarily and in terms of growth. When making informed decisions, it is important to gather the most reliable and accurate data. In some cases, like with English language proficiency, a measurement tool such as an assessment is required. The type of assessment you use determines the kind of information you will receive. This is why the assessment you choose matters. You have many options for measuring English language proficiency. But how do you know which is the best assessment method? The key attributes of any quality assessment are validity, fairness, and reliability. Validity is the extent to which the test scores are appropriate for a particular purpose. When we say fair, we mean assessments that are standardized, unbiased, and accessible to anyone, anywhere, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or disability. An assessment is reliable when the test scores are consistent across administrations. We at Educational Testing Service have over 70 years of experience and expertise developing valid, fair, and reliable assessments for educators and learners around the world. Every year, ETS develops, administers, and scores 50 million tests in over 180 countries. A commitment to rigorous research, 100% quality, fairness, and equity in education informs everything we do. In 1979, ETS developed the TOEIC program, now one of the world's leading English language assessments for the workplace. The TOEIC tests include features that any quality language assessments should have. These include a 4-skill approach, an evidence-centered test design, standardized and rigorous test security and administration, a consistent and reliable scoring process, and client support services ensures score users understand test scores.
The cycle of communication in any language is made up of sending and receiving messages. When we send messages, we use our speaking and writing, or productive skills. When we receive messages, we use our receptive skills, listening and reading. In order to gain a full picture of one's language proficiency, you must measure all 4 of these skills. The TOEIC program offers accurate measures of listening, reading, speaking, and writing, providing you with a complete assessment of English language skills. Listening and reading, the receptive skills, can easily be measured through multiple choice questions. For the productive skills, however, there are additional factors to consider. When we use our productive skills to communicate, we have an audience. In order to evaluate a person's speaking and writing skills, they must produce spoken and written messages. Unlike multiple choice responses that have a single correct answer, speaking and writing test questions are open-ended. This means each question could have several right answers. These open-ended questions are evaluated on several different kinds of criteria, such as grammar, vocabulary, task fulfillment, and appropriateness. In a professional work environment, an individual may use productive skills to write emails, give presentations, or exchange information with customers or colleagues. We want to help you make sure your employees have the skills necessary to perform these tasks at work.
One of the most important factors when choosing an assessment is test design. Here at ETS, we use a methodology called evidence-centered design for developing all of our assessments. This methodology ensures that the information gathered from the assessment is consistent with the underlying purpose. In other words, using evidence found through research to design a test ensures the test will measure what it is intended to measure. This process helps make certain that test results are consistent, reliable, fair, and valid, which is exactly what you need to make confident decisions. Test questions, or items, are carefully written by assessment developers who are experts in their given subject. Every item goes through a rigorous content and fairness review, Reviews are completed by multiple assessment developers before the test is assembled. After the test is administered, each item undergoes a lengthy statistical analysis to ensure that it functions as intended. Each question on a test provides data that can be used to evaluate a test taker's skills. In general, the more data collected on an assessment, the more accurate the results. When choosing a test, it is important to consider not only the number of questions, but also the different question types. The TOEIC program takes both into consideration. It uses an appropriate number of carefully chosen questions on each assessment to collect the right amount of data for an accurate result. ETS assessment developers use evidence-centered design to carefully choose question types that directly measure the skills and abilities that are needed for English in the global workplace. In addition, ETS researchers continue to support the use of TOEIC assessments through ongoing, extensive research.
But test design is only one of the factors that ensures consistent, reliable, fair, and valid data. Test administration and security are also very important factors. Standardized testing procedures ensure that test takers have the same testing experience no matter the place and time. Rigorous test security guidelines ensure that no test takers are unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged, and that test scores remain fair and comparable across administrations. ETS is a leader in test security and continues to refine protocols for detecting and monitoring security threats. In fact, many of the test security practices pioneered by ETS have become the industry standard and have been adopted by other companies and organizations around the globe.
Once test takers are finished taking the test, those tests need to be scored. The scoring process is a critical factor when evaluating a quality assessment. Listening and reading skills are measured using multiple choice questions, with which the objectivity of scores is certain. The scoring of multiple choice answer sheets is automated, and quality control procedures ensure accuracy. Speaking and writing skills, however, are measured with open-ended questions. This means that test takers are asked to produce spoken and written responses that must then be evaluated. The TOEIC program employs qualified human raters to evaluate TOEIC speaking and writing responses. TOEIC speaking and writing test scoring is a rigorous process built to ensure the most fair and valid results for every response. Unlike an interview test, for example, where evaluators may exhibit unfair biases, TOEIC test taker responses are randomly and anonymously assigned to raters, effectively minimizing bias. Each TOEIC speaking and writing test is evaluated by no less than 6 highly qualified raters. All TOEIC raters are required to have specific experiences and education. In order to qualify as a TOEIC certified rater, all applicants must complete a certification test. Each rater is qualified, certified, trained, and calibrated to each item type before they are able to score. For each scoring session, at least once per day, a rater must pass a scoring accuracy test, referred to as calibration, to ensure they are aligned with the scoring guidelines. Raters who do not pass calibration on any given scoring session are not allowed to score. TOEIC certified raters are also regularly monitored by scoring leaders to help assure complete score accuracy.
The complete solution. The TOEIC test design, test administration, security, and scoring processes give you the complete solution by ensuring that test results are truly valid, fair, and reliable. It is important to note that test results are only valid, fair, and reliable when they are used appropriately. The TOEIC program is dedicated to assisting score users with understanding and interpreting test scores through tools and local customer support, including assistance on setting cut scores or benchmarks. TOEIC test scores can be used to prepare students for the global workplace and support informed hiring, training, or promotion decisions. Your choice of assessment not only impacts your organization, but also builds the workforce of the future. 68% of global executives say that English is necessary to succeed in global markets. Prepare your organization for success by using the TOEIC program, the world's leading English language assessment for the workplace. To find out more about the TOEIC program, contact your local ETS preferred network member. Because for decisions that matter to you, the assessment you choose matters. Contact your local EPN member by visiting www.toeicglobal.com.
For business to be successful in today's global economy, it takes more than having a superior product or smart distribution. It takes international communication, and one language unites companies around the world: English. More than ever, English skill is becoming as important as technical skill. It has the power to take an employee from behind the scenes to the front lines, enhance collaboration among coworkers, even turn a local business into a global company. In today's competitive landscape, English proficiency is a business imperative. Without it, your company can't unleash the full potential of human capital, limiting your future growth. So how do you leverage the power of English within your company to help ensure success? Introducing a new documentary series, Why English Matters, presented by the TOEIC program. Each episode demonstrates how critical an English proficient workforce is for business and the advantages it provides to organizations and companies around the world. Why English Matters features in-depth interviews with executives, human resource directors, and employees, all from leading multinational companies. The series highlights how English proficiency accelerates productivity, inspires innovation, and helps you build a strong international workforce. Watch Why English Matters and get the information that matters to you and the success of your company.
So why the TOEIC test? Well, according to ETS from their website, the TOEIC listening and reading test is a valid assessment of English language reading and listening skills for the workplace. Employers worldwide use the TOEIC test to determine who can communicate effectively in English across borders and cultures with coworkers and clients. These particular skills are necessary for email, written reports, newsletters, and other forms of business correspondence. And your TOEIC scores can help to make you a stronger candidate for job opportunities with global organizations. Demonstrate your ability to communicate across borders and cultures with coworkers and clients. Positively affect hiring decisions and other employment opportunities. And help you obtain new opportunities within a company. So, what went into the design for the TOEIC test? Where did their content come from? Well, as you can see here, ETS, the Educational Testing Service, has basically looked at a wide variety of areas of business and, of course, everyday life as well to kind of help inform the test design. I'm not going to go through and read every particular item here on the list, but as you can see, several areas are covered: general business, manufacturing, personnel and recruiting, health, dining out. So if you especially have a lot of workplace experience before you take the TOEIC, certainly I think you will find that the test will certainly be something you're very well prepared for. And of course, I also like to tell my students in our program that the TOEIC is also very good for just kind of assessing your everyday language ability, your ability to communicate with people around you pretty much on a daily and weekly basis. Now, on the TOEIC reading section, there are 100 questions in 75 minutes. Basically, it's divided into 3 sections. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at Part 5, which is the incomplete sentences section. And there are 40 questions on the test. The other particular sections we will address in future videos. Now, oftentimes students want to know just exactly what do the TOEIC scores tell me. Well, this is one area in which ETS has not necessarily given us a lot of information, but this was done as a particular study in several different countries. This one, for example, is from Bangkok. It was done to kind of compile to see what were the particular scores that this particular set of 5-star hotels, what they were using to determine who gets what position in their company. Now again, first off, when they refer to total score, this was done back in 1999, so at the time there were only reading and listening scores. But as you can see here to the left, they indicate the types of positions that they have at these particular hotels, and then the types of minimum scores that they generally recommend for people to apply for these positions. So as you can see, obviously, a lower score would be for a position where English is not used as much. And then, of course, for people who actually have to engage the public, all the way up to assistant manager or outlet manager, a score of 600 is what they're looking for. And again, the maximum scores here generally range in the 900. So as you can see, this will give you sort of a frame of reference when it comes to scoring, and maybe give you an idea as to what particular score you might be interested in on the test. As we said before, 900, actually 990 is the maximum score range. This was also a particular study done in Switzerland for some of the positions in their country. So again, as you can see, positions where maybe the need to communicate in English is perhaps a little bit less, the score range is a little bit lower. And of course, looking at the upper end, the score range is a little bit higher. Actually considerably higher. Now, whenever we begin talking about any standardized assessment, it's always good to review a little bit about general test-taking strategy. Now, of course, just like any standardized test, we're going to be looking at the necessity for how to answer a multiple choice. Mainly because a lot of standardized tests follow the multiple choice route. But specifically for a test such as the TOEIC, different categories on the test will require different strategies. But first, let's look at the general strategy that we'll be using throughout this series. Now again, since this is a multiple choice test, it's best to understand how the test makers develop the test. So we're going to kind of look at a very simple sample question and kind of deconstruct it to see if we can understand how this test is created. So you will see here a fairly simple question, and I'm sure you probably already know the answer. Well, the purpose here first is to analyze the different parts of the question. So first off, the top part there that you see, oftentimes we will refer to as the question or the prompt. Now this one, of course, is a question because it involves a question mark. But sometimes it will not actually be a question, but it will prompt you, which is where the word prompt is coming from. It will prompt you to answer. Now below you will see the part that we refer to in general as the answer stem. This is where you can find the answer choices. So obviously the right answer, the right choice is the answer. But the other choices are often called distractors. So from the 4 choices in the answer stem, these answer options, 3 of them are going to try to distract you in different ways from finding the correct answer. So in this case, let's think about how do they construct these particular tests. How do they try to distract us or trick us? Well, if you have a test that has 4 to 5 answer choices, then this is sort of how the test design usually works. 1, of course, will be the answer. But 1 to 2 of the distractors will be completely wrong. In other words, they have no hope in any particular context of being correct. But then there are usually 1 to 2 distractors that look pretty good, except for perhaps 1 small problem. Now, the more experienced you are at taking this test, then probably the better you will be at utilizing this strategy, and maybe you won't necessarily need this particular part of the video. But let's assume for a minute that you did not know that this is how test makers create their assessments. So let's apply the strategy here to our simple question. So first off, which one or ones do we see would be completely wrong? Now for you, you may go ahead and know which one is the answer and eliminate all of the other ones. But let's assume for a moment. Let's try to imagine that we are the average test taker. Well, in this case, we could see easily that B is wrong. So the ones we have remaining, some of these might look good, but perhaps there's only some small problem with them. So why is that? And again, you may already know the answer, but I'm asking you not to choose it right now. Well, for example, Monday, letter A, might look good, but there's some small problem, which of course we'll discuss in a moment. And D has lots of numbers, so it could possibly be confused as the answer. Of course, if you knew the answer, then D would be an easy one to eliminate. But for example, look at A again. A might be acceptable, and again, only might, if it said, for example, on Monday. Now, that would not be the best answer choice anyway. Even if it said on Monday, that doesn't quite answer the question, what time is it? Generally, we associate time, of course, with like looking at a clock. But again, it might be acceptable in some other context. But the idea here is that it would not be the best answer choice for this question. And of course, D might confuse somebody because it looks like a bunch of numbers. But that's only in case they didn't recognize that this is a date and not a time. So in this case, we know now that C is the answer. So this particular process is called the process of elimination. Or from now on, we're going to refer to it as POE. Now, you need to master this process in order to become a better test taker. Now, first off, many students believe that that means that they'll just eliminate answer choices that they don't know. And again, that's not the idea. Oftentimes, you get a question with a set of answer choices, and maybe there are one or two answers that look pretty good. The idea here is that process of elimination is to give you a better chance. So the first thing I tell students is you need to be confident in those choices. So don't eliminate something if you don't know what it means. So only eliminate answer choices you know are incorrect. Now, this brings us to kind of a hint when it comes to general test strategy. And that's oftentimes what I tell students is don't just choose the right answer first. Make sure you can eliminate the other answer choices, and then you'll have a better percentage to guess the right answer. Now, obviously, if you know the right answer and are pretty confident, I'm not going to tell you to not answer the question. But in this case, what I'm trying to say is this is a process, a habit that we're trying to develop. So don't just choose the right answer yet. Just keep it in the back of your mind. Now, again, the difficult thing is when we start getting down to only a few choices. So, for example, if you've reduced your choices to maybe 2, and you have one answer choice that maybe you know and one that you don't, always try both in the problem and see if you know the other one of them works. If it does work, so if you have 2 choices, one you know, one you don't, and the one you know works, that probably is going to be the correct answer, or at least your best choice. But remember, process of elimination is not a 100% solution. So again, no test strategy is. The only way you're ever going to improve completely on this test is to improve your English. So remember, process of elimination is just to give yourself a better chance. Okay, now let's look a little more specifically at the first type of question we're going to see on the reading test, and that is the incomplete sentences, or question type number 5. Now, first off, we need to recognize that question type number 5 is going to involve 2 major areas. And, of course, they're going to have smaller subcategories in these areas as well. Well, those 2 major areas are grammar patterns and word choice. Now, grammar patterns focus on generally what we might consider to be word families. And also we will see uses of verbs, different forms, different tenses, and so on. The word choice questions, on the other hand, tend to be a little more confusing because oftentimes the words themselves will not be the same word. Whereas with the grammar patterns question, many times it'll be the same basic word, but just different versions of it. Whereas with the word choice, we often have different words, but the idea is they're all the same part of speech. So for example, you may have a list of words that appear to be very different, but in fact they may all be adverbs, or conjunctions, or prepositions. The last category is one that often does kind of involve more of the traditional sort of business or workplace, and that's just the general business words that we often confuse. And we'll take a look at some of those in just a moment. So again, you need to learn these 2 particular major areas because we will constantly be referring to them throughout the video, and you will need to sort of develop the, and kind of memorize and develop the habit of thinking about questions in these terms. Now, as I said earlier, with the particular types of questions, the good thing about the TOEIC is that the TOEIC has very specific sections. So, for example, the first part of the reading test is going to be this incomplete text. However, when we look at the questions in the incomplete text section, we often need to be able to recognize the type of question very quickly. In fact, we almost need to be able to recognize it before we try to answer it. So really what we're trying to do here in this video is to help you understand how to make those decisions based on which particular area is being tested. So for example, when you look at a question, do you know that it's a grammar question or a word choice question? And then that will help bring up a series of choices and options to help you in better solving the problem. So this is extremely helpful. This will help you both understand what the prompt is asking and what the choices in the answer stem are. Now we're going to look at 3 sample questions given to us by the Examinee Handbook, which is again produced by ETS. You'll be able to find a link to the handbook at the bottom of this video. And even though I will put the information here on the screen, I would highly recommend that you download the Examinee Handbook and use throughout this video series. So let's look at the question and prompt first for question number 1. A late fee will be applied to your account, blank. Payment is not received by March 31st. Now, at this point, what can we learn by just looking at the prompt itself? So, not looking at the other answer choices, but just the prompt. Well, first off, the key is to focus on what is there, not what is not. So, we're not going to pay attention to this blank just at the moment. We're going to focus more on what we do have. Well, as we divide the sentence into 2 parts, we notice that we have almost 2 grammatically complete ideas. A late fee will be applied to your account. Payment is not received by March 31st. Now, from these 2 choices, though, which one seems to be complete? Like, which one actually is complete by itself? Which one could you use as a sentence by itself? Well, that would be the first choice. Something seems to be missing in the second choice. Payment is not received by March 31st. It sounds like we were expecting something else to happen there. So we recognize that the second part of the sentence is not complete. It is missing something to make it complete, but what is that? Well, the next step now is to look at the answer stem. So by looking at the answer stem, we can get a more complete idea as to the major area that's being tested. So just by looking at it very quickly, does this seem to be a grammar question or a word choice question? Well, remember, if it's a grammar question, they would all basically be the same idea, but maybe in a different form, like different verb forms, or different members of the same word family. But word choice questions are the same grammatical category, but appear to be different words. So in this case, we're actually dealing with a word choice question. Now remember, word choice questions, instead of focusing on the grammatical usage, are focusing more on the meaning and how it's used in the context. So it would even be more helpful to think about what is the subcategory that these words belong to. So as we go back for a moment to the 2 major areas and focus on the word choice section, we can see that these types of questions fall into the category of connecting words or conjunctions. Now, what we're going to do very quickly is go through each one by one, and try to decide what type of conjunction or connector they are. For example, and is considered a conjunction that connects equal things. For example, a Sprite and a Pepsi. Whether is an adverb connector that usually relates to the condition of a choice. So, for example, I need to know whether or not you will go. But is a conjunction indicating a change or negation, but again, usually of grammatically equal things. I need this, but not this. So notice the particular balance of the sentence indicates that both ideas are grammatically the same. And then finally, another adverb connector that relates to a condition or choice. For example, I need to know if you are going. Now, which ones can we eliminate? As we said before, we generally want to try to find the ones that seem to be completely wrong first. Well, remember earlier we determined that both parts of the sentence are not equal, because both are not complete. Only the first part was considered to be complete. So in this case, A and C are conjunctions that we use only if both parts of the sentence happen to be complete. So in this case, we can easily eliminate A and C. What do we have left now? Well, now we have those 2 conditional connectors. Both of them are adverb connectors. But of course, they both cannot be correct. So now comes the point where we look at the strategy and think about, well, how do we compare the 2 to each other? In other words, what is the difference between them? Well, for example, whether usually indicates a choice between something or not, though that choice might be implied. Now, here's an example. Whether you were staying or not, I need to know how many people are coming. So notice in this particular situation, neither choice, whether you stay or you don't stay, these choices don't affect what's happening in the second part of the sentence. So in this case, we can think of the meaning of the word whether in this situation as similar to in spite of. So in this case, in spite of what you're going to say, I still need to know something. If, on the other hand, does not always mean that there is this choice. So for example, look at the sentence, if you are staying. So in other words, you've told me that maybe you're going to stay, so if you are staying, I need to know how many people are coming. Well, now in this case, it's a conditional situation, but we're focusing only on the one possibility. And notice that it will impact the decision I'm going to make. However, we don't know what the other possibility would be if the person isn't staying. So in this case, if you are staying, this is what I need to know. But if you are not staying, we don't know. It doesn't say or indicate that in the sentence. If we also think about an extra piece of information, tends to focus on the result of something. So if this were to happen, then something would naturally follow. Whereas in the first example with whether, the result of the condition didn't really matter. So in this case, which one makes sense? So we're going to try both of them in the sentence. A late fee will be applied to your account whether payment is not received by March 31st. Well, remember, whether indicates that there would be a choice there. There is no other choice stated or even implied. We don't know what would happen. So in this case, we're presented with only the one possibility, that something will happen if something is not done. So in this case, if is our answer. Now this brings us to thinking about a TOEIC shortcut. So think of these little shortcuts as sort of hints or ideas that will help you be a little more efficient on the test. So if you notice, when we looked at the prompt, we got some information about the question. But when we looked at the answer stem, we were immediately able to identify what type of question it was going to be. Was it a grammar question or word choice? So in this case, I'm going to recommend that you should probably look at the answer stem first in order to identify what kind of question it's going to be. And I think from there you'll be able to make a better decision, and certainly one that might be more efficient. Now let's look at question number 2. So this time we're going to look at the answer stem first. So here are my choices. Now once again, you notice these choices. So let's start thinking about what type of question it will be. What about the subcategory that it'll belong to? And then just to think about for a moment the part of speech. Now, for example, some of these kind of look like verbs, but then I notice 2 of the choices are adjectives. Well, immediately that should tell us that this is not going to be a grammar question. Because remember, a grammar question is going to be different parts of speech, but from the same type of word. In other words, they're going to appear mostly the same. These words do not appear the same. In fact, they actually are all the same part of speech. So in this case, we're looking at a word choice question again. Now, what category would it belong to? Well, looking over the choices, since they mostly appear to be vocabulary type words, words with a particular content, they belong to the last category, business words that we often confuse. So our answers are that this is a word choice question. It's a general business word, or confused, and as we said before, since they're word choice questions, that means the part of speech will be the same for all of them. In this case, adjective. So now let's look at the prompt. The award is given to an individual who has made blank contributions to the community through volunteer work. Now, what does the prompt tell us? Well, again, we try to focus on what is there. Well, I notice that the word contributions is the word that's right after the particular blank. I also notice that the word made is before the particular blank. So in this case, I can probably guess that contributions is actually the object of the verb has made. And that most likely, since we know we're looking at an adjective now, that the adjective is going to be directly describing the word contributions. So notice how much faster it was able to identify the idea by looking at the answer stem first. Now this brings us to a concept we call collocations or collocations. So what we're looking for is what we call a collocation. So what is that? Well, oftentimes when we have two words that seem to belong together, words that seem to have, even though they're not determined by their grammatical relationship, they seem to have a grammatical relationship between each other. For example, an adjective describing a noun, a subject with using a verb, or a verb using a particular object. And oftentimes this is something you will see on the TOEIC. So first off, let's look at some common examples of collocations. Now, for example, there are those collocations we might think of as things we see every day. And many of these are determined by perhaps context or even specifically culture. I know many times when I share these examples with my students, for example, I'll say bacon and many students don't necessarily know what the second word is. But what's interesting is almost every English-speaking American would probably say bacon and eggs. Now, others might know black and white because they seem to be natural opposites. But for example, if I said cream and, again, sometimes students from other countries would not necessarily know that Americans would say sugar, for example. So these particular collocations are ones that are kind of developed that we use almost every day, and we associate them together, and again, largely because of either our culture or the context that's defining them. Now, perhaps you can think of some others too. Now, some other ones, though, and these are the ones that we're probably going to see more on the test, are those that are very much contextually defined. So again, words that often tend to be maybe idiomatic, or words that do make sense in general business contexts, and these might also be true in other culture ideas as well, but generally they kind of reflect a particular idiomatic idea that's, again, specific to our language. For example, when we say somebody is a big deal, notice we don't really say a large deal. So in this case, we're referring to that he is somebody who's really important. But for some reason, we associate big and deal together. This is one of those kind of idiomatic type expressions that we just have to learn, and we generally can't substitute other words for them. The same thing with the second example. Satisfaction guaranteed. Now notice you could try to use substitutions, but they somehow lose the meaning. For example, satisfaction is similar to the idea of happiness or contentedness, but we can't guarantee happiness. And also when we say guarantee, generally we think of guarantee as something that's perhaps a little more formal than promised. We don't say satisfaction is promised, we say it's guaranteed, which generally means some sort of refund might be given if the product that you bought wasn't so great. We also think about computers, for example. We call them laptop or notebook computers. So again, of course, this is changing. We've got iPads and other things, but generally notice we don't use other words to collocate with computer. So again, many of these particular ideas are things that are defined by their context, and they oftentimes can take on an idiomatic dimension as well. So in this situation, we kind of have to think about which words do seem to go together with the word contribution. Now remember, a contribution is a donation or a gift, usually of money. So now let's look at our choices again. Which ones can we eliminate first? So thinking about which ones don't seem to go together with the idea of contribution, probably the first one we can eliminate easily is the idea of secure. Now, of course, this has kind of changed if we think about the internet, but generally we don't associate the word secure in contributions. We might think of a secure payment, perhaps even a donation that we can make in a secure way. But generally we don't say secure contributions. So in this case, this is one that we could probably eliminate pretty easily. Now the other three are a little more difficult. But I do believe if we look a little more carefully, we can also see that contributions themselves are not updated. However, this is perhaps, again, trying to confuse you because we think of updated perhaps as similar to the word recent. Now we can make a recent contribution, but we don't say an updated contribution. So again, this is something that you just have to learn through using, through experience, through listening and reading, and perhaps something you might have experienced before. So in this case, now we've got two choices. How do we decide between the two? Well, one thing I suggest for these types of collocative ideas is, first off, try the words in the blank themselves. And then, of course, think about the nature of the word contribution. Finally, look at the entire context. For example, we often think about contributions as how big or small they are. We generally don't think about contributions as being very detailed. In addition, when we look at the rest of the context, we recognize that this person is receiving an award for their contributions. So in this case, generally we give awards for people who give a lot of money or a lot of effort. So in this case, if I think about the word large, which again may not necessarily perfectly go in the blank, large is very similar to the idea of significant. So in this case, B is going to be our answer. So this brings us to our next TOEIC shortcut. When we think about general business words, we really do need to think about the other words that are going together with it. So generally the first thing I tell students is when you can recognize that these are just confusing business words, look immediately at the words before and after the blank. Oftentimes you might be able to guess the particular pattern even without even thinking too hard. However, as we saw in this particular example, if you're not very familiar with the use of the other words, again, you may have to start making some very kind of informed decisions as to how to eliminate those answer choices. But again, make sure you look before and after the blank in order to try to establish what particular words are going together with the business word. Now let's look at the final question for this video, question number 3. And again, looking at the answer stem, one thing we start to notice right away is that all of the answer choices seem very similar. Well, that should pretty much tell us right now that what we're looking at is a grammar pattern question. Now, since they were using the word establish, and they all appear to be verb forms, we're actually looking at the verb form and tenses idea. Now, with grammar questions, we have to think about, okay, what is the subcategory you're looking for? Well, for example, with verb questions, generally we look at the following things. The tense, so for example, is it present, past? The form, is it perfect or progressive? If it is a verb, what's the subject of that verb going to be? Is there an object to the verb? Is the form of the sentence going to be in the active or passive voice? Is there going to be a participle that's being used with it? And is there a helping verb together? Or is the verb going to be in an infinitive form, which generally is formed with to plus the simple form of the word? So let's look at the answer stem again and immediately try to identify, well, what are the verb forms we have? Well, A is an infinitive form. B appears to be the past tense, but it could be a past participle as well. In this case, C, we do have a verb in the past, but it's also in the passive voice. It was established. And again, the passive voice is usually be plus a past participle. For D, establishing, and we have to be careful here because obviously establishing could also be an adjective idea. But in this case, it's most likely going to be either a progressive or an active participle. Since we're all looking at verb forms, generally the TOEIC will not try to confuse you by mixing a grammar question and a word choice question. Now, since this is a verb-related question, we got to think of a few things. Verbs are very complicated. So when we look at the prompt itself, we need to ask ourselves these questions. When did the action take place? Who or what is doing the action? And is it even logical for this person or this thing to do it? Who or what is receiving the action, if that's even possible? And are we looking for a complete verb or only part of a verb? So for example, we saw that we had only a participle as one of the choices. Is there another part of the verb, like a helping verb, in the actual answer, in the prompt? Now let's look at the prompt. Last year, Andrea Choi, blank, the Choi Economic Research Center at Upton University. So when did it happen? Well, we see the words last year. Who or what is doing the action? Well, again, there's no other verb in the sentence, so we can assume that the person before the blank is going to be the subject. So in this case, Andrea Choi. Is it logical for this person to do something? Well, again, Andrea Choi is doing something, so that seems very logical. And who or what seems to be receiving the action? Well, in this case, it appears to be this research center is receiving the action of the verb. So it looks like Andrea Choi is doing something to this particular research center. And as we said, it seems to be logical. Now, as we bring back in the verb choices, we can see that the word establish does seem to be, in this case, needing something to where she is using the particular verb to do something. So as we bring back in the answer choices, let's try to expand a little bit on our thought process when it comes to elimination. So A, for example, an infinitive usually needs to follow another verb. Well, in this case, there is no other verb in the sentence. So I think we can go ahead and easily eliminate A, because A needs another verb in the sentence. Now this one could be used as the past tense, as an active verb. So we can keep it here for a moment. C is also in the past tense, but it's in the passive voice. Now, in this case, since we don't necessarily want to eliminate all of our choices yet, we're keeping B. Why don't we keep C as well, since both appear to be in the past? And finally, this is a participle, but as we mentioned before, participles usually need helping verbs. Well, in this case, there isn't one already in the sentence, so we're going to eliminate this one as well. Now, how do we decide between these two choices? Well, again, both are in the past tense, but the difference between them is that one is in the active and one is in the passive voice. So in this case, it does appear that that is the main difference. Well, since Andrea Choi is the subject and she is a person, it would seem logical that B would be the answer. We usually associate people as being the active subjects of verbs. In fact, this is generally how English works. So in this case, we're probably going to stick with B as our answer. So when we think about this particular question type, and again, this is less a shortcut than it really is a very important hint or a piece of advice, you really do need to be aware of all of the grammar rules as they apply to this part of the test. Now, as you've noticed, there are really only two basic sections. The word families section and the verb forms. So especially for the verb forms, you really do need to pay attention to how the verbs interact in the sentence. So if you see a verb, if you see verb choices, you need to think about the subjects and objects, the tense and the form, the active or passive voices, and of course the participles. Now, this obviously seems like, just generally good English advice to try to learn all of the grammar rules. But as you get more familiar with the TOEIC test, you will notice that most of the grammar questions they put generally are looking at words with just different endings, word families, based on the same word, or verb forms themselves. So I think you'll notice that that's generally the two main areas that grammar plays a part. Now here at the end of the video, it's your turn. First off, take a look at these two questions. Now, as we said before, the first thing we probably should do is look at the answer stems to try to identify what type of questions are these and which subcategories would they belong to. Well, if you look very carefully, both do appear to be word choice questions. If you look at the choice on the left, they appear to be the subcategory of generally confusing business words. The category on the right seems to be involved somewhat with pronouns, or some sort of referent type of idea. Now go through and try to eliminate the wrong ones first. So I'll give you a moment to look through if you want to pause the video and try to go through and see which ones would you eliminate. Okay, starting on the left side, as we look at the sentence, Mr. Ikeda, Miss Ikeda, and Mr. Arroyo are the final candidates under blank for the position of Director of Development. First off, we try to understand that the question is saying that there are two people being considered for this position. So in this case, we could probably go ahead and eliminate B, elimination, because they're being chosen, not eliminated in this case. And as we look at the answer choice on the right, of the two animated forms released today, blank is certain to be popular with children, while the other will appeal more to adults, it is apparent that they're referring to that there are two different audiences here. One seems to be popular with one group, and the other will be popular with another. So in this case, A doesn't make any sense. If they're saying that both will be unpopular with both audiences, that doesn't really seem logical. Now looking at the remaining answer choices, what's the difference among them? Now you may have eliminated other answer choices too, and in fact you may already know the answer. But let's take a moment just quickly to consider the difference among these choices. Well, for example, when we're being looked at as final candidates, we could think of consideration and confirmation as fairly similar. But generally we don't recognize candidates who are being considered for a position. Usually recognition comes to somebody who's actually done something famous, or have done something popular. On the right side, when we think about our answer choices, we look right away and notice that another does not seem to make too much sense. Even though we have the other, generally we think of another as when we're giving a list of ideas. So this would actually be something you would put after the first choice. Well, here in this case, this is the first of the two choices, not the second. So in this case, we could easily eliminate D. Now look at your remaining choices. Which ones do you think makes the most sense? Which ones do you think make the most sense? Well, in this case, A is the answer for the left side. Partly because of the combination here, the collocation of the words under consideration. Generally, people are not under recognition or under confirmation. Confirmation does not necessarily work in this case. Confirmation is not appropriate for the context of hiring. Generally, confirmation is something you might see in a religious ceremony. On the right side, certainly another we've just eliminated. But when we think about the two choices that are remaining, it does appear to be something logical. It is certain to be popular with children. But the question is, what is it? Remember, in the first part of the sentence, there are two animated films. So in this case, it and two don't actually go together. Since the second part of the sentence includes the words the other, generally we think of the balance between one and the other as being the appropriate sort of paired idea when it comes to pronouns. Hopefully you did pretty well with these two questions. So our final thoughts. Recognizing the type of question, whether they're grammar or word choice, and their respective subcategories will help you become more efficient on the test. POE, or the process of elimination, will definitely take time to learn at the beginning, but you will improve as you understand the design of the test better, and how the process of elimination will apply to each specific question type. Now, certainly I think these videos are going to be very helpful for you, but they're probably not going to be enough to give you the full picture as to what the types of questions you will see, or giving you lots of practice. First off, a lot of the information from the video is coming from the official TOEIC website. But there are also some ideas here from a textbook that I highly recommend, and this is one that's actually designed with the permission of the Educational Testing Service, and it's called the Tactics for TOEIC Textbook Series by the author Grant True. And we're looking right now from this first video from some ideas from the listening and reading test textbook. But I would also recommend that if you're interested in taking the speaking and writing test, there is a textbook for that as well. And then we are also in the process of developing our new TOEFL and TOEIC preparation website, for which these videos will be a big part. So you will find the link for that at the bottom of this video. So thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 2, Question Type 6, Text Completion.
My English before Intel was almost nothing. Intel is an American-based company with operations in multiple countries. Official communication is English, both written and verbally. We establish a relationship with our peers or with our reports. At Intel, we try to be a team and not just people working alone. The only way to connect the processes, connect people, and actually connect the knowledge is through English. When I hire people, sometimes they don't have the level of skills that we need right away. It is very sad to see young professionals coming out of school and coming to interviews, performing technically, and not being able to express themselves in English. English proficiency is critical. If it is not there, the person is not going to have the confidence, and they will have to come back, if they are asked to come back. One example of investment in bright people is Sakaraya.
When I was at high school, I had the opportunity to participate in a national science fair. I won the first prize, and since that point, Intel saw something different in me.
We follow up with him in the university. He got an Intel scholarship to study English, and then we were able to hire him in our quality and reliability department.
I'm responsible for the quality of the materials that we use at our company. So every day, I know there is going to be a note from some of my counterparts in Asia. If we have an issue with one product, we immediately set up a meeting with our counterparts, and we call each other by phone and share the information that we have. And we start to discuss in English that something is going wrong. It wouldn't be possible for me to do my job if I was not able to speak English.
At Intel, the official language is English, and that's how we connect every employee independently from their culture, their origin, their gender, in every country in the world.
I cannot imagine a company with more variety of people than Intel.
We have the opportunity to learn from their cultures. And diversity brings richness, it brings perspectives, and boosts performance of people and business. Because in Intel, the human relations and teamwork is a key piece that help us to be more successful as a company.
people from all around the world. And I have been able to talk to all of them because of English.
We're one company, one voice, with a clear vision.
In our previous video, we presented an overview of the TOEIC reading section. We said that the reading section contains 100 questions, and it should take you around 75 minutes to answer. In our first video, we talked about question type 5, which is involving incomplete sentences. In this video, we're going to be looking at question type 6, which is called text completion. Now, in this particular activity, you will notice that there are sets of readings, and each set will contain 3 questions each, basically totaling 12 questions. Now, the design for this section of the test will actually appear to be somewhat similar to that of Part 5, which is what we saw in the previous video. You will have to make a choice between 2 major types of questions and their subcategories. The two major areas that we're looking at are what we call grammar patterns, which usually involves distinguishing among different members of word families or parts of speech, or looking specifically at forms of verbs. The other categories involving word choice, and the many different ways that people can be confused by the choices of words that we use. So again, generally the questions will involve the same part of speech, but different actual words to choose from. And there are multiple categories here where the test will try to confuse you. Now we will be looking at 3 sample questions taken from the TOEIC Examinee Handbook. Once again, the link is provided at the bottom of this video for the packet that you can download. Now first off, let's just look at the question itself, or the sets of questions. It appears like this. So if you'll notice, first off, it does seem to appear differently from question 5 in the sense that there does seem to be a reading format. So what we're going to do here in this first part is just kind of give a general overview of how to actually answer questions on this part. The first thing you will notice is that it's an actual reading, and specifically it's an email. And if you notice, it actually states that here in the introduction to the questions. The next thing you might want to do is to go ahead and skim the whole reading first, just to get an overall idea of the text. Now, in just a moment, we'll talk about what skimming is. But for now, basically the idea is to look over everything quickly, just to get a sense as to what the general idea of this email happens to be. Then, as you actually get into answering questions, if you recall from the previous video, we talked about the difference between the prompt and the answer stem. The answer stem, of course, involves the 4 choices. Well, this is obviously a little bit different in the sense that, apart from question 5, where you had just basically 1 sentence to look at, here you have many sentences. So in this case, we're going to look at the answer stem to guess what type of question it's going to be, but you'll notice that we will need to go back and actually look at the text some more to figure out how to answer the questions. Then you may need to read the sentence itself and the other sentences that are adjoining, which means perhaps for the first question, for example, reading the sentences that come before it. Now, as you move along through the reading, you will notice that you will have to chunk or group more important pieces of information as you go to answer some of the questions later in the reading passage. So this is kind of our general overview of how we're going to answer questions on parts on this question type. Now this brings us, of course, to our first hint. What exactly do we mean by reading, skimming, and chunking? These may be new words to you. Well, again, reading is what most of us think about when we think about moving our eyes over the text. But to distinguish here, we're going to say that reading means to pay very close attention to something. So in this case, we're trying to look at the text to understand it deeply. Sometimes we may need to read a text several times in order to completely understand its meaning. Now, of course, you don't have a lot of time on the TOEIC to read something, but then again, you probably won't have to read it many times. It probably won't be that difficult to understand. Skimming, on the other hand, involves looking over a passage just quickly to establish just maybe the organization or what we call the basic idea or gist. Now, you really should not do this more than, 1 or 2 times on the test for each reading. So, in this case, skim it the first time when you first see the text in order to get the basic idea. But really, at this point, then you should jump into the questions. Now, this third word that we're introducing in this video is a process called chunking. Now, you will notice that chunking is a very flexible process, and oftentimes it involves how we look at information, how information works together. Now, we actually discussed this under the topic of collocations or collocations. And basically, collocations are examples of chunked text, but in the sense that they directly work together. So, for example, when an adjective describes a noun, we call that a collocation. That's because these two ideas are working together. So, in a sense, you could take both of the ideas and call this a chunk of language. Now, we'll talk more about chunking as we move along, and you'll see how collocations are also going to play a part. But again, the idea here is chunking is flexible. So, for example, as we read further along in the passage, you may have to chunk more information to look for things that are more connected, because in this case it may depend on more than just 2 words. Sometimes we may have to look at several ideas, such as words, sentences, or perhaps even paragraphs, and that will really depend on what you're trying to do. So, for example, reading the first question, we don't have to chunk a lot of information, but by the time you get to the third question, we may have to chunk a lot. So again, in this process, we skim at the beginning just to get the basic idea. We look at the answer stem in question to see, well, what is the question asking us to do? Is it a grammar question or a word choice question? And then we go back to the text itself and often need to read some information. Now, you'll notice that we read only when it's necessary. We don't necessarily want to read everything at the beginning. That takes a lot of time. But as we read, we may need to find pieces of information, to chunk pieces of information together that will help us in solving each problem. And that's what we're going to do in this video, is show how to do that. Now, of course, this brings us to discussing question type 6. Is it really that different from question type 5? You probably noticed that there are a lot of things that are similar. For example, the idea of the grammar choice versus grammar questions versus word choice questions. Those seem to be very similar. And in fact, what you're seeing here on the test, and this is something a little bit different from other tests in the sense that they want to provide some sort of context so that the test itself makes it look more authentic. So in this case, this is part of the Educational Testing Service's desire to present information in a more integrated way. So instead of just looking at a single sentence and trying to find the grammar or vocabulary idea, now ETS wants to see if you can put all of this information together. So using these more authentic looking materials, that is part of the idea of trying to understand how things work in context. So in this case, the answer is yes, there is some difference between the two. Chunking is a big difference here, because since we have more text that we have to look at, we're going to have to pay more attention as we move along. So yes, you can skim the text just to give a basic idea, but you're really going to need to pay more attention as you continue along in the questions. So in this case, you will need to chunk more and more information to answer questions as you go along. But again, only read text when it's necessary. So in this case, trying to read everything probably would take too much time. But if you see a particular question in which you can answer it fairly easily, then don't necessarily worry about having to go back and read everything again. So my general recommendation here is read only when it's necessary, but don't try to read everything at the beginning. So as you can see, there is a little bit of difference, of course, between the two, question type 6 and 5. There are some slightly different strategies we're going to look at in this video. Okay, now let's go in and answer the questions. Now remember our general testing strategy as we discussed in the first video. As we look at the answer stem, we're going to try to decide what type and what subcategory the questions belong to. But we're now going to chunk more information in the prompt to help us solve the answer. In question type 5, it didn't really take that much information to help us. Then we're going to have to read text if we need to find the answer. Of course, we're only going to read if it's necessary, which in this case, some parts of it will be necessary. And then we're going to use the process of elimination to help find the answer. And again, the process of elimination is something we talked about in the previous video. Okay, well, let's take a look now at the questions, and the first thing we're going to do is try to go through and identify what type of questions we have and which subcategory. So now let's look at it a little more carefully. Looking at question 141, look at the choices you have here. And I'm just going to scroll through these kind of in a little bit quick way. We're not going to actually answer them yet, but take a look at what we're asked to do. 142, look at our choices here. And then notice in 143, the choices look very similar to each other in meaning, but slightly different in form. Okay, so now that we've looked at the questions very quickly, now let's see if we can review what type questions we have and the subcategories. So for 141, we have a word choice question. Again, notice all the words are the same part of speech, but are different words in meaning. So in this case, it's a word choice question, and the best category they belong to are the general business subcategory. 142, again, we have words that kind of provide a transitional nature, but are different, again, in meaning. So we have a word choice question that belongs to the transition subcategory. And finally, 143, as I mentioned as we looked at it the first time, these appear to be words that had the same basic meaning, but different parts of speech. So in this case, that would be a grammar question, and specifically the verb form. Since they all appear to be in verb form, we're trying to figure out how to use them. Now, this kind of brings us to a trick that we perhaps noticed in the first video, but definitely going to take some time to talk about now. If you notice, many of the questions on the test so far have not necessarily been grammar related. They've been more related to word choice. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is because there are more opportunities to trick you with the word choice question. Now, why is that? Well, because you actually have to know the meaning of these words. So the process of elimination does become more difficult to apply if you don't know the meanings. So, for example, if you see 4 choices you need to eliminate, but you know the meaning only of 1 or 2 of those words, it's going to be difficult to eliminate the other choices if you don't know what they mean. So don't be surprised if you will see more of these types of questions on the test. Now, in general, if we think about it, where are the common areas where students can get confused with word choice? Well, we're not going to go through all of the particular areas of confusion here in the video in terms of how to identify them, but we're just going to talk about them in very general ways. For example, adjectives can be very confusing. One reason is because oftentimes students get the forms of adjectives confused, but also in comparison with adverbs. Adjectives also can be confusing because oftentimes they look like comparatives or superlatives. Phrasal verbs, of course, can also be confusing because certain phrasal verbs go together with certain prepositions. Connectors are especially confusing because they're generally those coordinate connectors in which we connect equal things, and subordinate connectors, which generally do not connect equal things, such as conditional connectors. Transition words. Again, transitions work on different levels as well. And, of course, the general business vocabulary. Again, these are easy to confuse because oftentimes we need to know how the words fit into the blank. So those collocative ideas that we're going to look at again here, that can be very confusing. Now let's go back and see if we can answer the questions. Now, looking at question 141, the first thing we notice is that many of the words do appear to be similar in meaning. For example, involved and joined and included all definitely seem to be very much related in terms of basic meaning. But the question is, how do they collocate or chunk with the information with the words before or after? Now, of course, now we realize that that's only part of the situation. We really do need to kind of go back for a moment and to investigate what this particular email is talking about. So I'm going to pull up my pen for a moment here, and as we go through the reading, let's try to see if we can identify what are some important pieces of information that might help us in beginning to answer these questions. Well, as we skim through the first time, we see that this particular email is about a performance bonus, and it is addressed to employees of a particular company. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, first off, what is a bonus? This is something that we probably need to know. Well, a bonus is usually something we get extra, usually for good work. So even before we continue to move on, skimming through the information, we want to see, well, did we get the bonus or not? Well, as I'm skimming through the first time, it says that there was a great success for us. So we want to be rewarded for excellent performance, and we've been approved a bonus for everyone. So as I'm skimming through, notice what I'm doing is picking up some important words here to start thinking about how to read. Now, we'll talk a lot more about some of these predictive skills in the next video when we talk about the reading comprehension section. But again, notice how I'm picking up some words already that kind of show me the general idea of what we're reading. Now, specifically, when I look at the particular sentence, now I need to figure out how do these words fit in the blank. Well, again, the first thing is a bonus. The bonus will be something in my next paycheck. So the bonus itself will be something. And N is the next word to collocate, the paycheck. So what I want us to think about for a moment is looking at this one sentence. You see, I just skimmed the sentences before it, but now I really need to pay attention to this sentence. Which words do seem to fit into this example? Well, let's start with our process of elimination. Which ones make no sense at all? Well, first off, we can easily eliminate C, I think, because bonuses aren't composed. Composed, for example, might be talking about music or composing a letter, but generally we don't compose bonuses. All right, now let's look at the other three choices. Now, another thing to think about is even though all of these words appear to be the same part of speech, the question is how are they used in the sentence? Well, look at the word that actually comes before the blank. It's to be plus this participle. Well, in this case, we do see that we're using a verb idea, but in what way? Well, in this case, it appears to be that we're using a verb in the passive voice. So what we're looking at first is which particular verbs make sense to be used in the passive voice in this context. Well, if a bonus will be involved in my next paycheck, to be involved in something sounds like somebody's actually doing something. Well, generally with passive voice questions, we ask ourselves, can people actually do something with this? Who is actually doing the activity? Is the bonus doing something, or is somebody doing something to the bonus? Well, in this case, we don't involve a bonus. We, as people, get involved in activities. So I think we can also eliminate A as a choice here. Now, as we continue to move along, we've got two choices left, joined and included. Now, again, when people join something, we think about, for example, joining a health club, joining a team. This would also seem to be a verb that makes a lot more sense in the active voice. So in this case, I don't think that would work in this situation either. Well, now let's look at our last choice, included. A bonus will be included in our next paycheck. Can somebody include a bonus in a paycheck? That seems to be true. So in this case, our answer is D. And this is because we often think about the word included being used in the passive voice. Okay, so as we progress, notice how we may need to look at more information before the next question. So in this case, this is something we may need to understand as we move along. How much information do we need? Well, as I look at number 142, remember that this was a transition question. So our first question is, well, what is the transition between the information up here, which generally seems to be fairly good information? We have success, Things have gone pretty well. We've got a bonus at the next paycheck. So how exactly will this connect? So that's kind of our first thing to think about. How much information do we need to chunk in order to see how it connects? Well, since this is a transition question, so we'll come back to our pen now. And as we look at our four choices. Instead, in addition, beforehand, or otherwise. Now, let's take a moment as we look at the answer stem to basically understand the meanings here. Well, for example, if something is instead of something else, this is basically giving us a different choice. So we'll kind of say right now that this is something that we're looking at that would be different from the information before it. In addition, on the other hand, would be information that we would add, so that the information before it would be similar in tone to the information that comes after it. As I look at C, beforehand, the basic meaning, of course, is it's something we do before something else. So again, beforehand is similar to before we do this. Okay? And then finally, when we think about otherwise, this is something that we would do that would be, again, perhaps slightly different from the information that comes before it. So we may have to do this. And talking about when we look at the difference between A and D, obviously these are not the same words. The TOEIC would never include two choices that are exactly the same. But we probably need to look at the text in order to better understand how these two words would be different. Okay, so now we look at the actual information. So first, let's read the sentence. So blank, we are now calculating wage increases for the upcoming year. So how would this connect to the information before it? Well, we said the bonus will be included in the next paycheck. So in this case, are we talking about information that would be different, the same, or are we indicating some kind of sequence? Well, I think as we can see, we're trying to say that bonuses are going to be included. And they're trying to figure out how to increase our wage for the upcoming year. Now, what's interesting, though, is we may need to keep reading. Because even though the sentence itself tells us that these wage increases are occurring, how does it actually connect to maybe some information that follows? Remember, this is a transition between one piece of information and the next piece of information. So just for a moment, let's look at the following text. So each employee's performance will be examined carefully as we determine the appropriate increase. So are we thinking, as we move back for a moment, are we thinking that the information here is going to be different from the information that follows? Well, as we noticed, it seems as if they're talking about more about how this particular bonus is going to be determined. So in this case, we can eliminate A and most likely eliminate D. Since these are both indicating differences or different directions, or something that might happen in spite of something else, these two don't seem to make sense. Now, as I go back, I also notice that paycheck, my next paycheck, is this particular bonus going to be for all of next year? Well, let's go back to the idea of a bonus. A bonus is something extra that we receive, but generally a bonus is something we receive one time. Here, we are talking about actually increasing our wages for the whole upcoming year. So the question is, do we consider that this is information that would happen before the bonus is going to be determined? Or is this information that's going to be extra in addition to the bonus? Well, again, generally when we do well, things improve. So in this case, the bonus is going to be included, and then as I read along a little bit more, each employee's performance will be examined. as we determine the appropriate increase. All full-time employees are eligible for this increase. So in this case, it seems like that we're not talking about that this step will be before something else. In fact, if I notice, the language here is involving the future. So in this case, I think our answer is going to be B, in addition to this information. So again, as we return, we notice that we were successful, we received a bonus, and then next, we're probably also going to get increased wages for the next year. So our answer in this case would be B, in addition to this information. Now, transition words can often be very confusing, but I wanted you to notice how I had to read before and now even look a little bit further ahead in order to understand how these transitions work. That's because transitions connect information that comes before it with the information that comes after it. Okay, now that we're back now to question 143. As we said before, we have to figure out how much information we need to chunk. Well, we have to be able to understand the information that came before it and, of course, the information that comes after it. Now, fortunately, there's only just a little bit more information at the end. It does say, thank you again for making last year a success. So in a way, this email appears to be doing two things. It's telling us what a good job we did last year and what benefits we're going to have for the next year. Now, as we look at this information, we recognize that it is a grammar question. All of the words basically seem to be the same meaning, but different forms. So, again, how much information do we need to chunk in order to figure out the answer? Well, since I don't have to think about the meaning of the word, I probably should think about, well, how would I make a choice as to which verb form to use? Well, as I go back through the paragraph, I notice now that we're focusing on this information here. So the question is, how much more do I need to go back in order to answer it? Well, since I don't need the meaning of the word necessarily, I may not necessarily feel like I need to go back and reread any of this information back up before question 142. So now we'll just kind of stick to some of the information here. Well, if I notice with verb forms, one thing I have to pay attention to are the different tenses that we see. For example, I see will. I see the first week of January. It's probably not January now if we're receiving a bonus or going to receive a bonus for the previous year. January is probably coming up soon. So the question is, are we going to be using something similar to the future? Because in this case, we don't know necessarily if the past is going to be necessary. So I think at this point we can eliminate A because the past is not what we're talking about. All right, now look at our other three choices. We probably could also eliminate D because also the D is the past tense but a different form. In A, we have what we would call the simple past. In D, we have basically what we would call the progressive, the past progressive. Both forms do not seem appropriate since both are in the past tense. So now we have B and C. And remember, part of our strategy is to decide between the two. Well, if we look at B, B is an infinitive form of the verb. So again, notice how I'm going through each answer choice and trying to decide the different ideas here. I can only eliminate answers, or I can eliminate only answers that I understand. So hopefully we do know what all of these different ideas are. Well, generally infinitives are ideas that we use after verbs. So as I go back up to the sentence here, I notice there is no verb here before the blank. In this case, it appears that B also does not work. Well, let's try C in the blank and see if we think it works. Your supervisor will inform you of the amount of your increase during the first week of January. So as I go back for a moment, I see that our performance will be examined. We are eligible for this increase, but we will be informed of this at some point in the future. So in this case, it appears that C is going to be the correct answer. So remember, a lot of the strategy we use for question part 5 we are going to use in answering the questions on Part 6. However, one of the big differences is we are actually going to have to pay more attention to the text around it. So even though a lot of the strategies of process of elimination are similar, you'll notice we're going to need more information to make these choices. And a lot of it will depend on the type of question. So again, if it's a transition question, we should think about how information connects from one idea to the next. If it's a grammar question, we probably should look around and see, well, what is the particular tense if it's a verb question, for example. So, our final thoughts. We said that type 6, the question here, appears to be very similar, but there are some key differences. First off, the questions are organized into a specific reading format, whether it's an email, a letter, news release, or so on. The type of question and the subcategories are the same. So these are the same things that you saw in question type 5. But as you move along, you notice that oftentimes we need to pay more attention. We have to chunk more information as we read to solve the later questions. Skimming the whole text at the beginning is probably helpful, but only read when it's necessary. So as you saw in our example, we skimmed through the whole text just to get the basic idea. But then we started reading when the question required it. So for example, in question 142, we had to read some of the information before and after it, because at that point it was necessary to answer the question. Once again, several recommended materials to help you improve your knowledge for this test. Again, the official TOEIC website includes lots of helpful free information, which is where our question came from today. The Tactics for TOEIC textbook series, again by Grant True, excellent resource for helping you prepare for the listening and reading test and the speaking and writing. And then, of course, our new TOEFL and TOEIC preparation website, the link of which you can find at the bottom of this video.
Let me think how to explain this in English.
Please take your time.
The world is more connected now, and English is the language of business.
In the case of Latin America, that is a Spanish-speaking population, we will have people and candidates that do not have the English proficiency that we were looking for.
P&G being a global company with operations in over 80 countries and our brands being distributed in more than 100 countries, we do have to be able to connect with our colleagues across the globe.
Sometimes at the beginning, I didn't have confidence when all my trainings and all the communication was in English. I wanted to cry.
Gretchen is one of our success stories. She started in a role that English was required, and at that time she didn't have the English proficiency for that position.
We have this opportunity to travel to Warsaw. I couldn't go because my limitation in the English, so I was so frustrated and also so sad because even when I lead this project, I couldn't be part of this workshop.
If the candidate has the success drivers that we're looking for at P&G, we will invest in their English training.
It's so hard to learn a new language, especially when you are not younger, right?
When we offer somebody a job, we're not offering a particular task per se. We're offering a long-term career.
We will invest in our employees by sending them to English schools, tutors on site, and also web-based trainings online.
By investing in our employees, we drive company results in every location where we have operations. It is very rewarding to see how our English program has enabled individuals to gain confidence in the way they manage their business.
Now I feel more comfortable.
They're influencing, they're negotiating, they're leading the way in a way that they were not able to do it before.
So now I am really so proud of me because now I can speak, I can attend my customers and also lead some meetings and some projects. Everything in English is like a big change.
So for us, investing in English is a deliberate choice and a business strategy.
In our previous videos, we've looked at parts 5 and 6 of the TOEIC reading section. In this video, we look at the final part, part 7, reading comprehension. Now, on the reading comprehension test, there are sections referred to as single passages, in which you have to read only one piece of text, and then there are there's another section referring to double passages, in which there are two pieces of text. Now, we will look at each one of these a little more carefully a little bit later in the video. But first, we're going to look at the general strategy and ideas behind Part 7. The reading comprehension section of this part of the test requires an understanding of several things. The business area that's being represented in the reading, the format of the reading passage itself, for example, is it a letter, a memo, etc. The main ideas, or what we might also refer to as the purpose or intention of the text, how details and facts work to support ideas, how vocabulary works in context, and making inferences and predictions. Now, for the next couple of minutes, we're going to look at each one of these in just kind of a general way. So first, we're going to start off with looking at the business area. Now, for the business area, it's important to think about what are the basic assumptions and characteristics of each area of business that's being represented on the test. For example, if you were to see a memo written to hotel employees, you might notice that it'll have some structural similarities to a memo sent to, let's say, corporate executives at a bank. But the content of these two memos would be different. And part of that is because this is relating to what we might call the audience of the reading. So on the test, you might see some questions that actually kind of think about, well, who exactly is going to need to read this information? Who might be interested? So as we said before, thinking about the difference between what hotel employees need to see compared to the executives who run the bank. So even though they might both be communicated to in a memo, their content, the information included, would be different. So again, these types of questions often ask us to think about who needs to read it and the purpose for reading and their particular purpose for reading it. Next, we're going to look at the format. Now again, when we refer to the format, we are talking about the actual way that the information is being conveyed. So for example, comparing a memo to the hotel employees compared to a letter. And in this case, a letter maybe to hotel guests. So for example, a memo would probably give sort of different information. For example, since memos are things that we usually give to employees or people that directly work under, supervisors and so on, a memo might contain some information as to some complaints that customers have had that need to be addressed. A letter, on the other hand, generally tends to be more formal and is usually sent to people outside of a particular company. So, for example, a customer may have given a complaint about the hotel, and that letter itself might be the complaint that the person has written. So again, don't be surprised to see questions, even though they won't directly ask you about the format, The questions themselves will definitely reflect the type of information that's being given. And of course, we can often think about why the format might help us in this idea. Next, let's look at the main ideas or the purpose. Now, when we skim the text at the beginning, you'll probably notice that we can pick out the sort of main ideas of the passage. And generally, I tell students there are 3 to 5 main ideas in a reading passage itself. So when you see questions involving main ideas, these that generally ask about the intention or purpose of the entire passage. So again, you might see a particular question that say, what's the purpose of this reading? Well, oftentimes you won't be able to tell just right away. You may have to look through all of the information first before you start getting an idea as to why this information is being written. For example, why would the CEO of a company be writing a particular letter to its shareholders, the company shareholders? So again, we have to kind of look through and say, well, you know what, there may not just be one simple idea. We may have to kind of combine information in order for us to kind of come up with an overall idea as to why the letter would be sent. And really, you can do this only by looking through the whole text. So in this case, when we see a main idea or purpose question, we may have to really take a moment and look through all of the text just to get a basic idea of what's being said. Now, sometimes maybe it's easy for us to figure out, but keep in mind it may not be. Now, the question, of course, is where can we find some of this important information? Where do we typically see main ideas in a reading? Well, oftentimes we forget to pay attention to the little parts, for example, like the title of the passage, or let's say if you have a memo, this might be referring to the regarding line in a memo. We could also find this kind of information at the beginning or ending of paragraphs, especially for reading more narrative text. And again, we might refer to those first sentences of each paragraph as a topic sentence. Of course, we can also find important information near what we call signal words. And this brings us to our first TOEIC hint. Signal words themselves are very important in reading. They involve a broad variety of words that help signal or indicate what you're about to read or how that information connects to information before or after it. Now, signal words can work on many levels. They can work between sentences to link sentences together. They can work inside of sentences to connect information together. They may even help connect paragraphs to each other. Now, signal words, again, come in many different categories. This is just only a small sample of the different types of words that you probably need to pay attention to on the test. For example, words that convey a sequence, things such as first or next or then. Words that indicate that an illustration or example is coming up. Words such as for example or such as. Signals that indicate a definition is coming, such as this is called or this is known as. Signals that give a cause or effect, something that's as a result or in effect. Finally, words that give compare or contrasting information. So for example, if we're contrasting, we might say something like on the contrary or on the other hand. You'll find a more complete list at the link listed below. And again, there are more categories than just these few. Now again, we talked about signal words. Obviously they're important and we need to learn them. We can also kind of recognize that signal words come in specific places. For example, at the beginning of sentences, often followed by a comma. So in this case, first, comma, the doctor wanted. So again, the word first would be an important signal. This would tell us that this is the beginning, perhaps, of a list. Maybe in the middle of sentences, often separated by a comma or even a semicolon. He said, comma, but she thought. Again, but would be considered a signal. He said, semicolon, however, she thought. So again, notice these two pieces of information are actually not the same. Many students think that but and however are basically the same word, but really they're not. So in this case, probably the two sentences where these are being found are probably giving slightly different information. We can also find signal words at the beginning or end of paragraphs. So signal words can often tell us where the important ideas are going to be. We will also see that they'll play a part when it comes to finding detailed information as well. Now, moving on to details and facts. when we refer to details and facts, oftentimes this means a question that will require us to scan for information in the passage. And again, scanning generally means looking for specific ideas. Now, one trick we can probably notice, and we'll see in the examples in just a moment, is that oftentimes the information that we're looking for may not be worded exactly the same way as is included in the passage. On the other hand, details or facts generally tend to be about important pieces of information in the passage. So they're probably not going to ask a question or a detail or fact about something that's not, very important or relevant. Generally, the detail questions involve something to do with the main idea of the overall passage. Looking at vocabulary, vocabulary in context usually involves understanding how words work in a particular reading. So the questions themselves are not necessarily business specific. So you're not necessarily going to see a lot of specific business terminology. But on the other hand, you may not often find words that will just give you the first definition. Sometimes you may be looking at the second or third definition of a word. Well, for example, a phrase such as the chair of the department. Now, we're going to leave the presentation just for a moment and go to dictionary.com. If you notice here in this example, we'll zoom in a little bit, that the first definition of the word chair, and again, chair as a noun, is of course referring to the piece of furniture. Number two is referring to something that might look like a chair or serve as a chair. So, for example, if someone is carrying an injured person, they might put their hands together to make a place for someone to sit. It's only really when you get to 3, 4, and 5 do you notice that we're talking about something that's not furniture related or serving as furniture, but actually talking about a position. And in this case, a position of authority or a person in a particular office, a seat of office, like, for example, the chairperson of a meeting, someone who's running a particular meeting. So in this case, with the vocabulary questions, don't be surprised if they're asking about a particular word that maybe you're not quite sure what it means in this context. Maybe you know one definition of the word, or perhaps two, but it may not be the definition that they're looking for. Finally, in looking at making an inference or a prediction, basically the idea is that making an inference refers to how to draw a logical conclusion using the information we're given in the text. So these are questions that kind of ask things such as what will likely happen or possibly happen. So that's the thing to think about on the TOEIC. When we see a piece of information, we have to think what will be the result of a particular action, or what is suggested by the passage. For example, if you see an announcement that mentions that all sales are final, which often happens on customer receipts, then a logical conclusion would be that people could not bring the item back for a refund. Now that seems fairly logical to us now, but notice again, it may not tell us directly that we cannot bring the item back for a refund. It may tell us only that the sales are final. So in this case, this is something we would have to logically conclude or to infer. And again, even though the TOEIC does not include a lot of inference questions, we do have to be prepared to draw a conclusion from the information that's given. So, let's review what we've done so far. As we said, the reading comprehension section will ask questions about a variety of things. The business area or audience that's in question, the format of the reading passage, the main ideas or purpose of the text, how details and facts work to support ideas, how vocabulary works in context, and finally making inferences and predictions. So, as we are getting ready to jump into the questions and the readings themselves, one thing students often want to know is, do we really need to read that much, or can't we just go to the questions themselves and use the questions to help us find the answers? Well, I often tell my students that when it comes to tests in general, the purpose of the questions on the test are actually for you to answer the questions. But believe it or not, sometimes the questions can help us understand what we're reading better. So part of the idea here really depends on, I think, the length of the passage itself. So again, sometimes students are looking for a shortcut, so they wonder, well, can I just look at the questions and go find the information? And that it might be possible, especially in the single passages that may be short enough. so that you could go to the questions and probably find the answers fairly quickly. But keep in mind, not all of the single passages are short. Some of the single passages are a little bit longer, and in fact, when you see the double passages, which have 2 readings, it may take longer and more time. And of course, you may have more questions as well to answer. So in these cases, it might be more difficult to go to the questions first. So in looking at 2 different approaches with single passage, if it's a shorter passage, it probably would be okay to look at the questions or the prompts first. Use those questions to determine how to go back and maybe read a little more carefully in order to find that answer. You can scan for the answers in the text, and remember, one thing we're going to reiterate throughout the video is that the questions are usually in sequence. And then you could use the process of elimination to remove wrong answer choices. But as we mentioned with the longer passages, it's probably going to be a good idea to at least skim the text first, just to get an overall idea of the passage and to locate ideas. Then you can use the questions to determine how to go back and read the information more carefully. You can scan for the answers in the text, and again, remember, the questions are usually in sequence. And then you can begin using the process of elimination. So to get back to our question, really the idea here is to think about how to use your time efficiently. So what I often tell students is that trying to read everything at the beginning anyway would probably take too much time. In this case, the more familiar you are with the content and form of the passage, it probably will be easier to answer certain questions. So for example, if you see an advertisement or a very short email, those are probably going to be more familiar to you as the reader. But, you need to pay attention to certain things that might give you information in a quick way. So, for example, the title and the format really will, I think, help in getting you to be more efficient on the test. And then, of course, keep in mind some questions may take more time. For example, detail and inference questions will probably require a more careful reading, or oftentimes going back and scanning for information. So keep in mind those types of questions may take more time and require more careful uses of the process of elimination. Now the longer passages, including those double passages, keep in mind you will see more questions. So that will also give you an idea depending on how much time you should spend in engaging with the passage. So as you will notice in just a minute, oftentimes the reading passage itself may not have that many questions, so it's not necessary for you to read everything. But the longer the passage is, oftentimes you will see more questions. Alright, we're just about ready to say our first reading. But let's think about for a moment how these readings are organized and give us a chance to kind of think like the test makers. So let's try a pre-reading activity. Let's imagine that we work for an art gallery and that we need to write a newspaper announcement of a public sale of various art items. Now think about just for a moment, what would this announcement look like? Part of the idea is to think about certain things that we would need to put in the advertisement. Think about the important information that we need to give. And of course, think about what would the actual format look like. If this were going to be an advertisement, now of course, we might want to think about including photos, perhaps, especially if this is going to be a large advertisement. But we need to think about, what kind of order would we put the information? What would go first? What would go next? What do we generally put at the bottom of an announcement? Finally, if we're going to capture someone's attention, we often need to think about, well, who would be the audience? And of course, maybe what part of the newspaper will we put this advertisement in? Now that we've started to think about some of these things, let's go ahead now and actually look at some sample questions from the test. Now you probably have realized at this point that the single passage we're going to look at first is exactly an advertisement for an art gallery. Now before we look at the questions, let's go for a moment and look at the actual advertisement itself. Now let's pull out our pen feature here and see if we can pick up some of the things we were trying to think about. First off, notice the organization and the format of the reading itself. At the beginning we have this sort of attention getter, attention art enthusiasts. So already we kind of know who needs to be reading this particular passage. Well, people who like art. Next we have an indication as to where and what exactly is going on. It's a sale at a particular gallery. Now, even if I don't read anything else in this particular passage, I can already pretty much guess what the rest of this text includes. If it's a public sale from an art gallery, and again I know it's an art gallery because right at the beginning I see that art is part of the discussion, and I know that's usually what galleries do, is display art. This is probably going to be an art sale of different kinds of paintings, perhaps sculptures, who knows. So again, notice I don't necessarily have to memorize all of the information that I see here. I just have to kind of notice some things. Here's the address. So we can kind of just put a little shorthand there. There's the address. Here are the typical the items that are going to be sold. So again, I only have to kind of notice those at the moment. This information here is the date and time. So again, how could that be helpful to us? Well, maybe there's a question involved, maybe not. And then at the bottom, I do see that there is a website involved. And again, usually, since we're used to buying things on the internet, more than likely we can find pictures, descriptions of these items online. So again, notice I don't necessarily have to remember all the information right now. I only have to pay attention as to where it's where is it located. And again, I think most of us can agree that this seems to be a fairly logical way to organize an art advertisement, an art sale. Okay, now let's jump into the questions. And let's kind of look at the questions for a moment to start thinking about some things. So, for example, as I look at the question types themselves, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about what kinds of questions they are. What are they asking for? And I can start to notice in the prompts themselves some key words. For example, in 153, I noticed the word purpose. In 154, I do notice the words people and online. So immediately when I look at the prompt itself, I can begin to start to identify what kinds of things they're looking for. So think about what types of questions are these? What are they asking for? Well, we're going to pull up our little chart here and kind of think about some of the things we discussed in the earlier part of the video. So look at our chart on the right side here. Can we match the idea to the question prompt? So in 153, what is the purpose? Well, that again requires us to look at all of the notice. So in this case, it seems to connect very well to our first question type here on the list. It's a main idea or purpose question. Okay, now what about 154? Well, in the language at the beginning, it says according to the notice, which means already I need to look through the notice. What can people do online? So that word what probably tells us we're looking for some specific piece of information. So instead, this is not a question about the purpose of the whole advertisement. This is actually looking for a specific piece of information, a detail in this case. Now we think about where in the text can we find this information? Well, it really is going to depend on the language in the prompt itself. So this gets us to think a little bit about our first TOEIC trick, and that is the idea of synonyms. Now, synonyms basically is referring to how we can restate information using similar words. And this is something that TOEIC really loves to do because it makes it a little more difficult to find the answer. So just for a moment, we're going to go back and look at question 154 again. Now, if you notice, as I look at the prompt, I do see those words online. But when I go back to the text, I don't see the words online anywhere. Instead, what I have to do is to be able to identify that online and website, which is listed here at the bottom, basically mean the same thing. Now, at this point, maybe you're pretty much familiar with that. So maybe 154 is not a very difficult question. But again, it helps us to illustrate how the TOEIC is trying to trick us. It's not going to use words that are exactly the same. It's going to involve finding words that basically have the same meaning. So keep in mind, the answer choices we're often looking for, they often do not have the exact same wording. This is a trick. So now let's try to see if we can figure out how to solve the answers themselves. And remember, be careful. In the answer choices, there may be some particular words that might trick us. For example, in 153, in thinking about the purpose, let's go through and use the process of elimination to decide which ones to keep and which ones to eliminate. So let's start with A, to announce a sale of artwork. Okay, well, I do see the word sale, so that's the same word, but I don't necessarily see the word artwork. So I have to think about, is artwork perhaps the same as art itself? I see the word pieces, oils, watercolors, tapestries. These seem to be examples of artwork. So for now, let's keep this one. We'll put a question mark. And B, to advertise the opening of a hotel. Well, again, I do see the word hotel and hotel here. So it's perhaps going to be the opening of a hotel. But again, why would you mention the word art in the ad? So in this case, B seems to be one we could probably fairly easily eliminate. Now C looks a little trickier. I do see the word painting, which of course does kind of relate to some of the ideas of paintings that I see. And of course painting is a type of art. But I don't see anything about an actual lesson or anything similar to it. I do notice that sale often has the same idea as discount, but in this case that is not the same idea. If something is on sale versus it is a sale, now we're confusing us with a particular word that is playing on a different meaning of the word. So in this case, we're going to eliminate. As we said before, be careful. Synonyms may be similar in meaning, but they may not necessarily make sense in this situation. Finally, to publicize a photography exhibition. Now that looks, again, like a possibility. Maybe this is going to be an exhibition of certain things. But notice photography, pictures or whatever, are again not necessarily included at the beginning. Perhaps one idea of a trick could be here at the bottom. But again, I think we pretty much know that if we know what oils and watercolors are, that's not necessarily the main purpose of advertising for a photography exhibition. So in this case, I think our answer would have to be A. It's the only one that makes sense. Now, how do I know that this is the answer based on the question? Well, remember, the purpose questions oftentimes require us to skim all of the information. But I think we can probably see that it didn't take very long if I just go back and look at the beginning of the advertisement. I could probably pretty much guess without having to go too much further. So notice one thing we talked about earlier is that often questions do come in sequence. So I want us to think about that as we look here. Notice how that first question can be answered somewhere near the beginning. So even though it is a particular purpose question, this particular ad is fairly easy to look at very quickly. Now the second question we've just talked about was the fact that notice how 154 is asking about a question that's closer to the end of the text. And again, that was the trick that we saw with the idea of online versus the website. Now these are the only two questions for this reading. So in a sense, notice the sequence is that 153 is somewhere at the beginning, and 154 is going to be somewhere after it. It's not always true that the first question will be at the very beginning and that the second question will be at the very end, but it is true that 153, in terms of what it's looking for, it can be answered in a way before you probably need to answer 154. So in 154, how can we answer the question? Well, now that we know where to look, we're looking now at this part. What exactly can we do online? Can we purchase anything? Well, again, I don't see that we can purchase things, even though I do see the word select. Select in this case is actually describing the word items. And it looks like we basically can see descriptions and pictures, but I don't think that we can actually buy anything online. Again, this is a public sale. That's what it says here at the beginning. Can we order tickets? Well, that seems like a logical thing to do online. But again, I don't see any information about how to pay or how much it would cost to buy tickets to this event. And of course, it says it's a public sale. So in this case, we could probably eliminate that one as well. Register for art classes? Well, again, online would seem to me that we could probably register something. Of course, that was true for A, B, and C. We often do purchase things online or order things online or register things online. But once again, we do not see a description of art classes. We do know that it has something to do with art, but in this case, not about instruction. So probably D is going to be our answer, but let's take a look at it anyway. Well, notice again here how synonyms can often help us. View is very similar to the idea of description. We can view these items online. We can see them. So in this case, it seems pretty apparent that D would be the answer. So notice how synonyms oftentimes can trick us, but synonyms often can reveal the answer. Whereas in other situations, words that seem to appear in the text may actually trick us as well. Art and art here. And of course I see select and I see select here. So again, if you notice, these are things that can trick students if you're not paying much attention. Now let's move on to the double passages and questions. Now first off, let's kind of compare the two. The double passage section involves much of the same strategy, but there is one key difference. Since there are two passages, we have to think about how these two are somehow directly related to each other. So think about how the first passage, how might it mention and relate to the second one? So as we look at this example, we're going to actually think about some things that we're going to try to guess even before we skim or read or do anything with the body of the text itself. So look at these two pieces of information and notice right away what are some things we can guess. Well, first off, the easiest thing to see is the format. So what are the formats of these two readings? Well, on the left side, it does appear to be a letter. And as I scan and skim through the information of the second passage, I have to look a little bit more carefully to see it appears to be something from a cafe, and I see the word certificate, and I do see an amount, and again, remember the TOEIC is an international test, so in this case, this is the symbol for a pound, which is the currency in England. So this particular amount off of a particular price. So this appears to be either some sort of coupon or maybe gift card. Now we have to really think to ourselves, what could possibly be the connection between these two pieces of information? Well, for example, is it possible that the gift card was contained in a letter that was being sent or mailed to somebody? That's a possibility. Could the letter be a request for a gift card or a coupon? That's a possibility as well. Of course, it's going to really require us to look through all of the information, but notice how, again, we're starting to think, how are these two things related? That's something we need to think about, because, again, we have to ask ourselves, why are there two pieces of information? Clearly, the TOEIC would want you to think about that relationship. So, on the double passages, we do have to do a little more work. First off, we think about those formats and how they could be related. Next, we're actually going to have to take a moment and skim through them. If we can skim through them, we probably can either confirm or change our particular guess about how these two things are related or connected. Next, when we look at the questions, we need to think about what types of questions are being asked. As we said before, the questions are usually going to be in sequence. And then we use the process of elimination. So let's look at the questions. Here's question 181. Why did Simon Jenkins write to Gene Sokol? Well, already we've got something to start looking for. Who are these people? And why did this person write to this person? In 182, in the letter, the word reservation in paragraph 1, line 5, is closest in meaning. So here we're looking at the actual definition of a word. So these are some things we can already start to look for. And of course, notice how the TOEIC is trying to help you at least by giving you, in 182, for example, where exactly to find that word. Now, looking at our question types, we start to think, well, what types of questions are these? Well, 181 asks the question why, which would seem to relate to the actual entire purpose of the information. So the question is, why did this person write this? So thinking about the letter, why was the letter written by this person to Gene Sokol? Question 182 is fairly easy to identify because it's asking about vocabulary. But notice it's asking about the idea of the word in the context. So we'll come back to this in just a moment. Now let's look at the remaining three questions. What is suggested about Gene Sokol? 184, what is Simon Jenkins offering? And 185, where does Simon Jenkins most likely work? Again, looking at our question types, just to try to guess, part of the idea is to think about those key words again. Suggested. 184, what is someone offering? And 185, where does Simon Jenkins, but notice this word here, most likely work? So in this case, 183 and 185 are asking us to infer something that may not necessarily be directly stated. Whereas 184 is most likely going to be a detail question because it's asking us to look for something specific. What? Of course, it may not be easy to find, but we're not necessarily making a conclusion. It most likely will be in the text that we're looking at. Okay, so now we have the questions on the right side, and then what I've decided to do is just to put the letter first on the left side. First off, we will probably notice that since this is the first reading passage, we probably need to focus on this one first. And that's most likely because several of the questions do seem to connect to the letter and not the gift card. But we'll think about in a moment what the gift card represents. So, going through each question now, let's try to identify what we're looking for. Well, first off, who are Simon Jenkins and Gene Sokol? Well, Gene Sokol seems to be a person that the letter is being written to. And Simon Jenkins is the person who wrote the letter, and this person is a director of guest relations. Now, a guest relations where? Well, maybe that's something to which the gift card does have a connection to. Well, at this point, let's skim through the information very quickly, picking out some key words. So, Gene Sokol appears to have written a letter concerning a visit to a restaurant. Now, it seems to be because the person, Mr. Jenkins, says that he is sorry that she did not have an enjoyable experience. So it looks like something happened at the restaurant. So in this case, as I already see in the first few sentences, we can probably guess that this is a complaint letter, or at least a response to a complaint. Now, look more carefully at the problem. They had to wait over 30 minutes. They had made a reservation. This is a typical situation where the restaurant or director of the guest relations would say that this is an isolated incident and that we usually do a very good job. This is the promptness of our staff. So in the second paragraph, as I'm skimming through, I see some words, maybe I know, maybe I don't. In an attempt to remedy this unfortunate situation, I'm sending you a complimentary voucher to use at our restaurant. Now, voucher, for those of us who don't speak British English, voucher is probably a word that we would think of as a coupon or a discount. So in this case, that is most likely what the second piece of information is, a voucher that this person can use the next time they go to a restaurant. And if you have any other need or assistance, you can contact me. Now, certainly, as you can see, you have to have some experience with these types of letters. So oftentimes I tell my students that the TOEIC represents things that we experience in everyday life. Maybe you've never written a complaint letter before, but you probably have some basic idea as to how a complaint letter is organized. So again, notice how the format of the letter also gives us an idea that we probably can expect to see some of that information in the questions. So now we look at 181 again. So why did Simon write to Gene? So was he thanking her for visiting a restaurant? Well, again, maybe. We'll put a question mark. Was he apologizing for poor service? Well, we definitely saw the words, I'm sorry, and we did see the idea that something was unfortunate. So this one definitely seems like a keeper. Is he asking or inquiring about her dining experience? Well, actually, she already discussed her dining experience in the letter she mailed first, that she had to wait for a long time. So in this case, I think we can eliminate C. And then finally, D, is he inviting her to an awards dinner? Well, again, notice the trick here. There is some kind of invitation, but it's not an invitation to a place necessarily, or an event, but actually back to the restaurant to use that voucher. Now, of course, an awards dinner does seem to be a little bit tricky. And, of course, the word dinner itself does seem to be tricky because it's referring to a dinner that the person came and tried to have at the restaurant. But in this case, they're not inviting her to any special ceremony. They're actually just inviting her to come back. So at this point, we've got A and B to choose from. And again, as we said before in process of elimination, oftentimes we want to give ourselves at least two choices to kind of eliminate and think about which one is the better answer. Well, in this case, he probably is thanking her for the information. But notice I don't see the word thanks or thank you for informing us. It does say here that I agree about something, but I think we pretty much can identify at this point that Simon is apologizing. Again, the words "I'm sorry" would pretty much tell us that something went wrong. And again, remember what we said about the questions in sequence. So again, this information is at kind of the beginning of the reading. Well, so that's where the question is asking. All right, in question 182, since it's a vocabulary question, we actually need to just scan for the word reservation in the text. So, let's see if we can change our color here. We're going to reset. So in this case, finding the word reservation, let's use that instead. We look through the text and we see there's reservation. And again, part of the idea is a concept we referred to in an earlier video, the idea of chunking information. Well, in this case, we make a reservation, and this reservation is in advance. Now, you may already know one or two meanings of the word reservation, and in fact, the meaning you probably know is the one that's being questioned here in the reading. But again, if you notice, some of the choices we're given are acceptable meanings of the word reservation. So, for example, if you have a reservation about something, that could also be considered a hesitation, even close to the idea of a doubt. The problem is both of those make no sense here. We don't make a hesitation, especially connected to a restaurant, and we certainly don't make a doubt. From our other two choices, it does appear that supply also does not seem to make much sense either. And I think at this point we probably can guess the answer is D. Because when we think of reservations in a restaurant, we're making appointments necessary in a way. Again, the question is asking which one is closest in meaning, not necessarily exactly the same. So again, for the vocabulary questions, be careful. They may have some of the definitions of the word listed as some of the choices, but it doesn't work in this context. Okay, let's move on to 183. So now thinking about what is suggested, something we kind of have to infer from the letter. Well, in this case, since we scanned through the letter itself, let's go through the answer choices and see if we can go ahead and guess. So, for example, she has recently traveled to Manchester. Well, that's a possibility, but it says here that the restaurant is in London. So those do not seem to connect. Again, it might be possible, but it doesn't seem to be proven here in this reading. She spoke to Simon Jenkins on the telephone. Again, that might be a possibility, but again, as we notice at the beginning, it says we received a letter. So we probably can eliminate this one as well. She wrote a letter of complaint. Well, that does seem to make sense here because at the beginning it says, I have received your letter, which would definitely imply that someone wrote a letter to Mr. Jenkins first. So let's keep that one. And then finally, she frequently dines in London. Again, that's a very real possibility. But can we really make that guess from this particular letter? Not really. It might be true, but it's certainly not being addressed by the information in this reading. So again, that's one of the tricky things about looking at inference questions, is that oftentimes we see answer choices that look very possible, but don't make sense in this context. So in this case, I think we can guess that C is the correct answer. Okay, moving on to the next one. So what exactly is Simon offering? Well, again, part of the idea is scanning through the text, and most likely we're not looking at information anymore in the first paragraph, but now we're starting to look at information in the second paragraph. So in this case, what is Simon Jenkins offering? Well, let's go through the choices. Is it a refund? Is it a discount on a future purchase? Are we replacing a damaged product? Or are we offering special assistance in ordering a product? Well, right away we can notice that part of the trick is playing on the word voucher. Now again, remember the TOEIC is an international exam. So some people also might think of vouchers as, something you would do to replace something that's broken, or that you would use to buy a particular product online, or at a restaurant, or at a business. So in this case, the two that we can eliminate first are C and D. Because we're not talking about a product, we're talking about an actual visit to a restaurant. Now, A and B both seem to be fairly logical responses to a situation such as this. But as we know, that both cannot be correct. Well, as we said before, a complimentary voucher basically means a free voucher. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you get to eat for free. It really does mean a discount. Now, we can say that because looking at the, if we go back for a moment and look at the actual certificate, as we go back to the certificate, we notice that this particular voucher that we're referring to is a discounted price. So as we see in this case, the voucher is referring to a price off the price of a meal, not a refund for something previous, or, again, money that you would get for a damaged product. Okay, so in this case, we can see that the answer would be the discount. Now, finally, with 185, where does Simon Jenkins most likely work? Now this one's pretty tricky. If we go back here and see here that Jeannie Sokol herself is from Brighton, and she's writing to Simon Jenkins, who's the director of these guest relations, we can think about, is Simon Jenkins in a different location? Well, we do see the idea that the restaurant is in London. And since he's the director of guest relations, there's a very good chance that London would be the answer. Now, since this is the last question, it probably would be a good idea to go back and actually look at the double passage again and look at the actual gift certificate. Because the gift certificate, since it is the last piece of information to read, we probably need to make sure we look at that before we finish. Because again, with the double passage, we have to understand that there could be a question about any piece of information. Well, first off, we see that the cafe itself has different locations: London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Now again, the letter says London. At least that's where Jeannie went, or Jean. But as we look at the, as we might call the small or fine print, it says, for customer service or inquiries, contact Winchester Falls Guest Relations Department by telephone or by mail at Twickenham Road, Manchester. Now again, the question was asking about Simon, and Simon is the director of guest relations. So in this case, we have to be able to sort of guess that guest relations here is referring to guest relations here. So in this case, as we come back to the answer, this is one of those inference questions where we have to do a little more thinking. So where does he most likely work? Well, definitely not in Brighton. Possibly in London. But since we identified that guest relations is actually in Manchester, this is probably going to be the answer. And again, remember, 185 was the question that came last, and most likely it's going to be about one of the last pieces of information you're going to read. So, some final thoughts. First off, think about the length of the passage to determine what you have to do. Now, if the passage is longer, then oftentimes we may have to do more reading. But as I tell students, do only what's necessary. Again, sometimes students want to read a passage and read a passage several times, and that really is not a good use of time. If the passage itself only requires a couple of questions, then really think about if the questions will tell us what to look for, then we probably need to read only what's necessary. So for the shorter single passages, I think it's probably a good idea that you can use the questions first to scan for the information. Now, if you want to skim through the text too, that's okay, but part of the idea is how can we be more efficient on the test. So in this case, if you wanted to go to the questions first, it probably would be okay. However, if the passages are getting longer, and especially those double passages, we've got to do a lot more work. We've got to think about the format of the reading. We will need to skim the entire passage to see what the basic idea of the readings happen to be. Now, we can use the questions to determine how much to read. For example, with that vocabulary question, we didn't have to read the entire passage, only the information around it. But for the purpose questions, we probably had to read at least a few sentences and possibly even scan the whole text. Of course, for double passages, we have to do even more. We have to think about the connection between the two ideas, and then probably skim both of them to think about and try to better understand what the relationship could be. Some final thoughts in terms of the questions themselves. Remember, they're going to be in sequence. So the first question is usually answered closer to the beginning. The second question is usually somewhere after that, and so on. And remember, there are some tricks on the test. The TOEIC does love to restate information, so be careful with choosing answers that might have some of the same words. With the vocabulary questions, remember that the TOEIC may not necessarily be testing you on the first definition. It may be testing you on the second or third definition of a word. And oftentimes we do need to think about the context and how that will help us solve the problem. Once again, just want to remind you that there are some great materials out there to help you prepare for the test. The official TOEIC website, the Tactics for TOEIC textbook series by Grant True, and our new TOEFL and TOEIC preparation website. And that's also where you can find a link to these videos and future videos that will be forthcoming.